1945. When World War II in Europe came to an end, the true tragedy only began for thousands of German women. Allied forces swept in from two directions. From the west came the American-British-Canadian coalition, and from the east came the Soviet Red Army. Age no longer mattered. Every woman became a victim of abuse of power and fear. Homes were requisitioned, families torn apart, and images of the afflicted appeared everywhere from the capital city of Berlin to East Prussia and the region of Silesia. Those women endured mass violations of their bodies, along with countless assaults on their dignity that drove them to despair. Many chose to depart this world forever, to free themselves from the unending spiritual anguish, leaving post-war society ever more unsteady after one mother could no longer bear her suffering and was lost, and another daughter slipped away without anyone to remember her, and bodies were left lying by the riverside. All of it became known, yet was swiftly buried in silence. Who permitted these acts to occur? Why were the victims' cries for help left unrecorded? While a curtain of silence shrouded the post-war narrative, that indifference not only dimmed their voices, but also created a void, the void of justice forsaken. This is the chapter of history overlooked, the darkest place in peacetime, where the pain of thousands was erased under the so-called peace that followed the conflict. At the end of April 1945, the Third Reich was gasping for life under pressure from two fronts. From the west, the American-British-Canadian coalition crossed the Rhine River and advanced into key cities. From the east, the Soviet Red Army pushed forward relentlessly, carrying the memory of suffering from Stalingrad and Leningrad. On the 25th of April, 1945, in the town of Torgau, on the banks of the Elbe River, American soldiers of the 69th Infantry Regiment and Soviet troops from the 58th Guards Corps shook hands, a symbolic moment, marking Germany's complete encirclement. Meanwhile, in the capital city of Berlin, the final confrontation raged from the 16th of April to the 2nd of May, 1945. Three Soviet commanders, General Georgy Zhukov with the 1st Belarusian Front, General Ivan Konev leading the 1st Ukrainian Front, and General Konstantin Rokossovsky commanding the 2nd Belarusian Front, simultaneously launched an unprecedented artillery offensive. Tens of thousands of guns and rocket launchers pounded the German defenses, leveling defensive positions across the city. Over 2 million Soviet troops, backed by hundreds of tanks and aircraft, poured into the city. Civilian Militia, Veteran Wehrmacht, Soldiers, and fanatic SS units could only hunker down amid the ruins, defending each building as a final stronghold. What had once been a flourishing metropolis was now a desolate testament to the fall of an empire. German defenses had become a patchwork of desperation-hardened veterans who once stood at Paris's gates or reached Moscow's outskirts, now held battered positions alongside fanatic SS units that saw final stands as acts of honor. Even elderly veterans from the First World War and 14-year-old boys of the Hitler Youth, armed with whatever weapons they could grasp, were thrust into the fray. Every ruined structure was repurposed as a fortress. Subway stations served as makeshift shelters. Each alleyway and shattered window concealed unseen hazards. The Malta Bridge, a vital north-south artery in Berlin, faced an intense counterstrike. Under the roar of aircraft and the staccato of heavy machine fire, Soviet armor finally surged across, sweeping aside barbed wire barricades and overturned trams. From General Zhukov's sector, waves of infantry advanced on the Chancellery and the Reichstag, once symbols of Nazi authority pushing through underground passages and grand reception halls, now reduced to rubble. The city's proud landmarks lay silent. marking the end of an era of domination and the inexorable collapse of the regime. While the battle raged above, Adolf Hitler remained hidden in the underground Führer bunker beneath the Chancellor's garden. On the 29th of April, 1945, he drafted his final political testament, casting blame on Jewish people and his own commanders. The following day, after a modest wedding ceremony with Eva Braun, they ended their own lives. He by his personal weapon, and she by ingesting a fatal toxin. Their remains were carried into the garden and set aflame by loyal aides, in accordance with his instructions, though the fire could not consume everything. On the 2nd of May 1945, General Helmuth Weidling formally signed Berlin's surrender to the Soviet forces at a school in the city's eastern sector. Despite this accord, a few die-hard SS units held out until the 8th of May. When Germany issued an unconditional capitulation document, the victory, though hailed around the world, left Berlin in ruins beyond measure. 70% of its buildings lay damaged or unusable, and the human cost was staggering. 100,000 German soldiers and 80,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives in the brutal contest for the city, while tens of thousands of civilians perished amid the chaos. Streets were choked with mounds of rubble, pipelines burst, power grids collapsed, and hospitals already strained were further crippled by shortages of staff and supplies. Hunger was everywhere. Average food rations dropped to between 700 and 1,000 kilocalories per day, well below the level needed even for basic survival. Just weeks earlier, at the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the leaders of the Allied powers had laid the groundwork for post-war Europe. They agreed to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. The Soviet Union would administer the East, the United States, the South, Britain, the Northwest, and France, the Southwest. Even Berlin, situated deep within the Soviet sector, was split into 4 sectors under joint control. To oversee this colossal undertaking, the Allied Control Council was formed with a clear mandate to demilitarize Germany, eradicate Nazism, institute democratic governance, and decentralize economic power. Yet the alliance that had brought down the Third Reich fractured almost immediately. Ideological rifts between those who prioritized rapid economic reconstruction and parliamentary democracy and those who insisted on socialist reorganization quickly emerged. In the Western zones, American and British authorities encouraged the revival of private enterprise and free elections. Factories were repaired, and provisional parliaments began to take shape. Meanwhile, in the Soviet zone, industry was systematically dismantled and transported eastward as reparations, and a single-party model was imposed, abolishing independent labor unions and free press. Berlin, the once proud capital, became the epicenter of a growing standoff. The 4-power arrangement that was meant to safeguard unity instead highlighted the gulf between competing visions. Regular meetings of the Allied Control Council descended into deadlock. As each bloc vetoed measures passed by the others, supplies meant for the entire city were unevenly distributed. Residents in the western sectors enjoyed restored utilities and ration cards that gradually improved, while those in the eastern sectors endured harsher shortages and stricter controls. By 1949, these divisions hardened into separate states, the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east. Berlin sat at the heart of this new Cold War, a divided city, emblematic of a divided continent. What began as a concerted effort to rebuild and reform Germany had sown the seeds of a decades-long confrontation. The very mechanisms designed to secure peace occupation zones, shared governance councils, economic directives became the fault lines of suspicion and discord. Thus, the collapse of Berlin and its subsequent partition remind us that peace imposed by foreign powers can fracture under the weight of conflicting ideologies. The rubble of once grand avenues gave way not only to physical barriers, but to political ones, setting the stage for a protracted struggle over how a shattered nation and a war-scarred world would find its way forward. The Soviet advance into East Prussia and Silesia was driven by more than a strategic objective. It carried the weight of accumulated outrage from 4 years of the Great Patriotic War. On the 22nd of June, 1941, Operation Barbarossa marked the beginning of an assault on Soviet territory aimed at the eradication of entire populations. Over 70,000 villages suffered total devastation, and countless civilians endured hunger and hardship during the prolonged sieges of Leningrad and Stalingrad. These collective memories of suffering and loss fueled a desire for retribution as Soviet forces entered German lands. When the Red Army crossed into East Prussia in late 1944 and pressed on into Berlin in April 1945, some units no longer restrained their anger. Reports from the front lines described the harsh treatment of those captured physical punishments that left prisoners maimed and humiliated. In some instances, elderly women and young girls were subjected to public violations before the eyes of their families, as if forced to serve as grim testimonies to the occupiers' resolve. Even senior officers who attempted to enforce discipline found themselves powerless against the tides of collective fury that swept through their ranks. In a meeting with Yugoslav representatives, Stalin offered words that effectively sanctioned these excesses. He stated plainly, "A soldier who has endured thousands of days at the front deserves to find relief with a woman or a drink." This remark, taken as an unspoken directive, meant that any acts committed in that name would go unpunished. The intensity of these reprisals reflected the depth of Soviet loss, an estimated 20 million lives, and the devastation wrought on communities across the Western Soviet republics. For many soldiers, the war had blurred the line between military engagement and vengeance. Hardship endured at home translated into a license to inflict suffering abroad. The breakdown of unit cohesion allowed local commanders to turn a blind eye, while political officers, tasked with morale, often justified extreme measures as necessary for final victory. This wave of uncontrolled anger left its mark not only on those who suffered, but on the very fabric of post-war Europe. German civilians found themselves caught between fear and humiliation, unsure where to seek protection once the tanks had rolled past. In homes stripped of privacy, in cellars turned into temporary shelters, the sense of safety vanished, replaced by an overlay of suspicion and dread. Yet the historical record remained incomplete for decades. Frontline correspondence was censored, and many survivors lacked the means or the will to come forward. Only with the gradual opening of archives and the publication of memoirs in later decades did the full scope of this collective venting of rage emerge. Scholars now recognize that while retribution may have eased the pain of defeat for some soldiers, it deepened the wounds of ordinary people and added a bitter legacy to the broader story of liberation. In examining these events, we confront a hard truth. Wartime suffering begets its own cycle of reprisals unless restrained by strict discipline and a firm commitment to justice. Without such limits, even those who once fought for survival can become agents of further suffering, perpetuating the very cycle they sought to end. Medical records and police reports from Berlin in 1945 reveal a grim tally approximately 100,000 women, ranging from young adolescents to the elderly, suffered forced violations between April and August that year. The aftermath proved devastating. An estimated 10,000 of these survivors did not recover, succumbing to injuries, complications, or overwhelming despair. One case exemplifies the heartbreaking reality. A 17-year-old in Prinsenberg endured such severe trauma that she passed away 2 days later due to an untreated infection. Her mother, unable to bear the sight of her daughter's agony, took her own life that same evening. In the wintry reaches of Silesia, entire communities faced a different kind of ruin. An isolated village was left desolate, its homes ransacked and burned, while women were paraded through the ruins and then left without provisions until their strength failed. War correspondent Margaret Hillers captured the escalating crisis in her diary. Troops stormed the underground shelters where families sought refuge, dragging women into the open for public dishonoring. Every shred of private shame was laid bare. The collapse of local law enforcement and the utter breakdown of civil society meant that few incidents were ever recorded or investigated. With sheriffs and constables displaced or incapacitated, and courts unable to convene, survivors found themselves without legal recourse. The social stigma attached to their suffering further silenced many. Fear of being labeled impure or ostracized left scores unwilling to step forward. In neighborhoods where makeshift medical stations struggled with scarce supplies, doctors did what they could. Yet the urgent need to treat physical wounds rarely extended to offering psychological support. Many women found themselves alone, grappling with trauma that could never be fully erased. Some attempted to rebuild their lives through sheer determination. But the specter of what had happened followed them like a silent shadow. Aid organizations struggled to deliver relief. Food and medicine were in short supply. Transportation networks lay in ruins. Relief workers often prioritized visible injuries over the hidden scars of forced violations. International Red Cross teams noted that while supplies reached some districts, they scarcely scratched the surface of overwhelming need. Women sometimes risked further abuse by venturing out to seek help only to find themselves ignored or, worse, treated with suspicion. Over time, the stories of these survivors began to emerge in memoirs and investigative histories, but only after decades of collective silence. Scholars have since pieced together fragmented testimonies, hospital ledgers, and personal letters to reconstruct the scale of the suffering. What becomes clear is that beyond the immediate horrors of conflict, a secondary crisis unfolded, one that left entire communities grappling with shame, loss of trust, and the daunting task of forging a path forward without adequate acknowledgement or support. In confronting this chapter, we are forced to recognize how the chaos of war can undermine both justice and compassion. When institutions fail and prejudice prevails, those most vulnerable pay the heaviest price. The wartime breakdown in Berlin serves as a stark reminder. Safeguarding human dignity requires vigilance not only during conflict, but in its wake, ensuring that all voices are heard and all wounds addressed. According to declassified Pentagon documents, the United States Army was responsible for approximately 11,040 incidents of bodily violation in Europe between 1942 and 1945, with the majority occurring during the final months of the conflict and the earliest months of the occupation. In Munich, the United States 7th Division formally took control of the city on the 30th of April 1945. Almost immediately, numerous women came forward reporting assaults, while residential areas remained chaotic and law enforcement was unable to maintain order. Similarly, in West Berlin, when American forces assumed authority over the Wilmersdorf and Charlottenburg districts in July 1945, reports of violations surged dramatically, presenting a crisis of law and order for local administrators. The U.S. military court system tried 190 cases of bodily violation. Of these, 29 individuals received the harshest sentences, penalties reserved for the most severe breaches of conduct. However, statistics reveal a stark disparity. The majority of those handed the maximum penalties were soldiers of color, whereas white soldiers typically faced only administrative sanctions or transfer to another unit. Racial bias of the era created an imbalance in victim protection. White women had comparatively easier access to legal recourse, while women of color were often left without adequate support. The effects of this injustice were profound. Many survivors, overwhelmed by despair and isolation, in a system that failed to protect them, chose to end their own lives. Countless accounts describe young mothers, wives of returning servicemen, not simply absent due to physical wounds, but emotionally abandoned by the very institutions meant to ensure their safety. Military authorities ultimately acknowledged that without stringent oversight, troop units could abuse their authority in a legal vacuum. Military law was strengthened. Units received explicit orders to safeguard civilians, and offending soldiers faced more rigorous disciplinary action. Yet these reforms arrived too late to prevent the deep psychological scars inflicted on numerous families. Post-war life was not only about rebuilding physical infrastructure, but also about healing a society that had lost faith in its own laws and in justice. It took many years and concerted awareness campaigns and revisions to military regulations before mechanisms to support survivors and prevent further violations were established. The painful reality remains that, during a period when civilians relied on occupying forces for security, women found themselves threatened by those they trusted most. This stern lesson of history demands that any future military engagement place civilian protection above all else and hold perpetrators of dignity violations unequivocally accountable, regardless of nationality or wartime circumstance. British soldiers are seldom mentioned, yet at least 15 cases of bodily violation were recorded by military police between May and July 1945 in the Spandau and Tiergarten districts of Berlin. One notable example involved a 32-year-old woman in Spandau who lost consciousness from asphyxiation and later died upon returning home. Witnesses identified the perpetrator as a member of the British 11th Armored Brigade, but the case file was promptly closed without any definitive conclusion, leaving the matter of accountability unresolved. In southwestern Germany, the French forces, particularly the Goumiers from North Africa, left a shocking legacy. During April and May of 1945 alone, over 1,400 incidents were documented across Freudenstadt, Constance, and Bruxelles. Among these, on the 8th of May, 1945, 12 women in the Wedding district of Berlin reported violations while sheltering in underground bunkers. Victims described being dragged out of hiding and compelled to endure these acts in front of their families. During the same period, the case of a single mother in Freudenstadt caused widespread outrage. After being pulled from her temporary refuge, she endured severe violations without any intervention. The perpetrator, assigned to a Goumier unit, faced no investigation, despite the victim's efforts to report the crime to French military authorities. French commanders appeared more concerned with preserving the image of liberator troops lauded by European public opinion. often shielding their soldiers from scrutiny. Internal reports on violations of human dignity were shelved, emerging later only as cold statistics. Many survivors felt profoundly betrayed. The hope of safety brought by occupying forces instead transformed into unrelenting fear. The truth about these events only surfaced when military archives were eventually declassified, revealing that concealment was driven not merely by a lack of information, but by a deliberate effort to protect the occupiers' reputation. Yet the emotional wounds of the victims could not be healed by apologies alone or by administrative reprimands. This pivotal moment posed a critical challenge for the post-war era: how to restore justice and public trust, when those expected to deliver freedom abuse their power to undermine bodily integrity and human dignity. It demands stronger oversight mechanisms, clear regulations, and international cooperation to prevent future violations. History cannot overlook these dark chapters. Every community and every military force involved in such sensitive phases must face responsibility with transparency. Only through full acknowledgement and open accountability can society move forward, firmly grounded in the principles of respecting human dignity and safeguarding the safety of all individuals. Regardless of wartime circumstances or nationality, the aftermath of non-consensual violations left a profound mark on public health and social well-being. In the months following the conflict, up to 15% of urban women contracted sexually transmitted infections, such as syphilis and gonorrhea. This alarming rate stemmed from the collapse of medical infrastructure. Hospitals operated without sufficient staff. Pharmacies ran out of antibiotics, and makeshift clinics could only address the most urgent physical injuries, leaving many infections untreated simultaneously. Between 10,000 and 20,000 children were born as the result of these violations, often labeled cruelly as children of shame. These infants were abandoned in overcrowded orphanages. Their mothers, impoverished and stigmatized, lacked both the financial means and the social support to care for a child conceived under such traumatic circumstances. Orphanage records from one Berlin facility documented hundreds of new arrivals within a single week. Each tiny life, a reminder of the city's broken promises of safety. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Many survivors exhibited symptoms now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder flashbacks, nightmares, and an overwhelming sense of vulnerability. Chronic depression and social withdrawal became common. A pastor's memoir from the wedding district recounts the case of a 34-year-old schoolteacher who stopped speaking for months. In Moabit, a 19-year-old refugee refused all meals, repeating, "I do not deserve to live." Such expressions of self-condemnation reflected the depth of internalized stigma and despair. Between May and December of 1945, approximately 10,000 Berlin women took their own lives, an estimate likely lower than the actual figure. Given the many unreported or misclassified cases, suicide notes, when they surfaced, told of lives overwhelmed by isolation and hopelessness, not simply physical hardship. These tragedies underscored the failure of social and health services to address invisible wounds. Conservative attitudes in post-war Germany compounded the crisis, influenced by both Catholic and Protestant moral frameworks. Communities often blamed the victims rather than the perpetrators. Women who came forward seeking help found themselves accused of losing their purity, as if the responsibility for their suffering lay with them. Families that once relied on tight-knit bonds now rejected daughters, wives, and mothers, fearing social disgrace. In some reported instances, Women returning home were shunned or even abandoned by their own kin. A few accounts describe spouses or parents who, unable to reconcile the stigma, forced survivors out of family homes or cut off all support. This culture of blame intensified survivors' torment and inhibited any collective effort toward healing. Rehabilitation programs, when they existed at all, focused narrowly on physical recovery. Overlooking the necessity of psychological counseling, support groups were rare, and those that formed did so in secret, for fear of public censure. The legacy of these years extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Survivors carried their trauma into new communities as they resettled, and the social fabric of neighborhoods remained frayed by mutual suspicion. Only decades later, with changing attitudes toward mental health and gender equality, did Germany begin to acknowledge the full scope of these violations. Retrospective studies highlighted the importance of comprehensive care, medical, psychological, and social, for all victims of conflict-related violations. This chapter of history underscores a fundamental truth: recovery from collective trauma demands more than physical reconstruction. It requires a societal willingness to confront shame, to offer compassionate support, and to ensure that the most vulnerable are neither silenced nor abandoned in the aftermath of upheaval. Immediately after Berlin's surrender, millions of German civilians in East Prussia, Silesia, and surrounding regions fled westward to escape the advancing Soviet forces. They formed long convoys of horse-drawn wagons and foot columns, winding through shattered roads and past the remnants of ruined communities. Among these desperate journeys, numerous women fell victim to forced violations, and some never returned home. Temporary reception camps in Poland and Western Germany soon became overwhelmed. Water supplies ran low, food rations were meager, and medical services collapsed under the weight of mass arrivals. In this vacuum, opportunistic groups formed, exploiting the chaos to prey on the vulnerable under the guise of providing aid. Makeshift shelters offered little security, and those tasked with management often lacked training or resources to protect residents effectively. Within the camps, young women, single mothers, and the elderly found themselves at the mercy of local power holders, former members of the disbanded German military who had switched allegiances, or Allied soldiers posted to oversee the sites. A 1947 study conducted by Berlin authorities revealed that up to 25% of displaced women required hospitalization for physical and psychological trauma sustained during the eastward flight. For many families, the dual ordeal of forced violation and extreme scarcity shattered any hope of unity. Fractured households fell apart under the strain, leaving children orphaned and wandering in search of care. Kidnapping of unaccompanied minors became a grim reality, further destabilizing an already fragile environment. Camp administrators, struggling to maintain order, faced a growing crisis. Relief convoys, intended to deliver essential supplies, frequently became targets for theft, leaving the most desperate residents without basics such as clean water and medicine. In some locations, the very individuals entrusted with security contributed to the problem, engaging in activities that eroded trust. Women reported that calls for help went unanswered or were met with skepticism, reinforcing a pervasive sense of abandonment. Despite these challenges, a few dedicated aid workers and local volunteers stepped forward. They established discreet support networks to escort the most vulnerable to safer areas, coordinated clandestine medical clinics, to treat infections, and organized discreet counseling circles to address emotional scars. However, these grassroots efforts could not fully compensate for systemic failures, and survivors often faced an uphill battle to reclaim a sense of normalcy. By the time more structured relief programs were implemented, often under newly formed international organizations, the damage had been done. Family ties had been irrevocably broken, and community cohesion lay in ruins. Attempts to reunify families were hampered by incomplete records and the transient nature of camp populations. For many, the journey westward meant leaving behind not only their homes, but also the possibility of returning to what they once knew. This chapter serves as a stark reminder that liberation can be undermined by neglect. When mass displacement is met with under-resourced responses, vulnerable populations bear the heaviest costs. True recovery demands not only the cessation of hostilities, but also the immediate establishment of robust protections for civilians, particularly women and children, ensuring that those fleeing one threat do not fall prey to another. Through transparent accountability and well-coordinated humanitarian action, societies can prevent the descent of emergency camps into breeding grounds for further trauma. Amid the prevailing disorder, children emerged as the most vulnerable group. Reports indicate that girls as young as 12 to 14 were forcibly removed from underground shelters to satisfy the urges of numerous soldiers acting in concert. Those who survived bore lifelong scars, both physical and emotional. Many of these young girls lost their parents to the turmoil, whether through collapse under pressure or self-inflicted ends, and were left to navigate an already overwhelmed orphanage system that lacked the capacity to provide adequate care. The infants born from such non-consensual acts, derisively labeled as bastards or children of shame, were often abandoned immediately after birth. These newborns were left in overburdened orphanages, where tenderness was a rare commodity and prejudice ran rampant. A 1948 medical survey in Berlin documented more than 200 infants deserted in just the first 6 months of 1945 without proper nourishment or attentive guardianship. Many of these children succumbed to malnutrition or illness, while others suffered neglect and abuse within the very institutions meant to protect them. As these orphans grew, they encountered persistent stigma. Peers and adults alike cast judgment upon their origins, reinforcing a sense of exclusion and self-doubt. Educational opportunities were limited, and social services for emotional development were virtually non-existent. The few available caretakers, often themselves traumatized, struggled to offer consistent support, leaving a generation of young people to wrestle with identity issues and persistent feelings of unworthiness. Civil society, preoccupied with rebuilding infrastructure and addressing immediate resource scarcity, placed the needs of these children at the periphery. International relief agencies, newly established and still finding their footing, prioritized broader population needs, inadvertently overlooking specialized programs for orphans of violence. It was not until child welfare advocates documented the systematic neglect that targeted interventions began to appear. Yet these efforts came years too late to reverse the deep-rooted effects. In subsequent decades, retrospective analyses underscored the critical importance of early childhood stability and the provision of safe environments. Psychologists studying this cohort found elevated rates of attachment disorders, chronic anxiety, and difficulties forming trusting relationships. Intervention models that included foster care placements, trauma-informed counseling, and community mentorship proved effective when enacted, but only after the children had spent formative years in supportive settings. The plight of these young survivors highlights a broader lesson for post-conflict reconstruction care for displaced populations must extend beyond physical needs. Protecting children from further harm requires proactive measures, safe corridors, child-focused shelters, and specialized staff trained in family reunification procedures. Moreover, social stigma must be actively countered through community education and inclusive policies that recognize every child's right to dignity and belonging. By recognizing these failures, modern relief operations advocate for child-sensitive planning from the outset of humanitarian responses, case registries, mobile health units specializing in pediatric care, and educational continuity programs are now standard components of many international protocols. While these measures cannot erase the trauma experienced by those early orphans, they seek to prevent similar tragedies in future crises. This chapter serves as a stern reminder: the security and well-being of children must never be overshadowed in the aftermath of conflict. Building a resilient society begins with safeguarding its youngest members, ensuring that every child hears the message of protection, respect, and hope no matter the circumstances of their birth. A pervasive pact of silence, unspoken but universally understood, bound the military authorities, religious institutions, and German society in a conspiracy of restraint. Occupation officials, eager to restore civility and infrastructure, discouraged survivors from reporting violations, fearing that each public accusation would undermine fragile stability. Churches, tasked with spiritual guidance, often prioritized national reputation over personal healing. Confessions were heard, but rarely led to advocacy for justice, as preserving communal honor took precedence. Within families, an additional layer of concealment took hold. Parents and spouses, burdened by shame and fearing social exclusion, opted to suppress painful truths rather than risk dishonoring their household. Conversations about individual suffering were silenced at the kitchen table, leaving survivors to shoulder trauma in solitude. This collective decision to obscure the past created barriers to emotional recovery, as wounds that could not be spoken of, could not be addressed. Cultural norms on purity and propriety further deepened the chasm between experience and expression. Women who had endured non-consensual acts found themselves trapped by expectations of discretion, their voices muted by a belief that endurance equated to virtue. In villages and urban neighborhoods alike, neighbors who might have offered support instead averted their gaze, reinforcing an environment where acknowledgement of wrongdoing was too risky for all involved. It was not until the late 1980s that the first chinks appeared in this wall of silence. Declassification of military archives began to reveal official reports and orders that had long been hidden from public view. Concurrently, pioneering historians such as Anthony Beaver, Norman Neymark, and Miriam Gebhardt published meticulous studies that synthesized archival data with survivor testimonies. These groundbreaking works brought to light the systemic nature of the abuses and the scale of the cover-up. Yet by the time these truths emerged, countless survivors had already passed on, their stories untold. The opportunity for communal healing had slipped away, leaving family members and future generations with only fragments of memory and a legacy of unanswered questions. For those still living, the belated revelations provided validation, but also reopened old wounds that had never fully closed. This chapter in history underscores a stark lesson: trauma left unspoken cannot be healed. Societies that prioritize unity over accountability risk, perpetuating cycles of suffering that span decades. Transparent acknowledgement of past wrongs is not an act of recrimination, but a necessary step toward reconciliation. By confronting uncomfortable truths, communities affirm the dignity of survivors and create a foundation for genuine resilience. In response to this hard-earned insight, post-Cold War Germany implemented measures to institutionalize remembrance and support. Memorials were erected, educational curricula were adjusted to include these suppressed chapters, and counseling services, once scarce, became more widely available. Survivor networks and research initiatives received funding, ensuring that future generations would neither forget nor repeat the silence of the past. The legacy of this silent accord remains a cautionary tale for all nations emerging from conflict. When the imperative to rebuild overshadows the need for justice, the voices of the vulnerable are drowned out. Upholding human dignity demands vigilant systems of governance, spiritual leadership, and community life must foster spaces where truth can be spoken, are heard, and transformed into a shared commitment to prevent recurrence. Only then can the promises of peace include genuine healing for every member of society. As the Allied powers turned from victory to reconstruction, they swiftly formalized the division of Germany into East and West in 1949, laying the groundwork for a Cold War that would endure for nearly half a century. Berlin, once the emblem of national pride, became a city split in two, with a formidable barrier erected through its heart. Neighborhoods, streets, and even families found themselves severed by ideology rather than geography. The painful legacy of wartime violations and post-conflict mistreatment faded into obscurity beneath the weight of political tension, silenced by the ever-present specter of competing worldviews. In this new order, East Germany came under Soviet administration, embracing a centrally planned system and strict oversight, while West Germany aligned with Western democracies, prioritizing market reforms and parliamentary governance. The division turned Berlin into a focal point of global rivalry checkpoints, controlled movement, watchful eyes, monitored interactions, and trust between neighbors gave way to suspicion. The wall, both literal and symbolic, underscored that liberation had morphed into a prolonged standoff. Amid these seismic shifts, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reported that over 12 million Germans were forcibly displaced from ancestral homes in the Eastern Territories. Entire communities were emptied as populations were expelled or fled, leaving towns hollowed out and family structures irrevocably altered. Millions of households fractured under the strain of resettlement, cultural uprooting, and the struggle to rebuild livelihoods in unfamiliar regions. Though the immediate focus lay on infrastructure, economic recovery, and the restoration of governance, the undercurrent of post-war mistreatment persisted. Displaced individuals, already coping with the aftermath of conflict, found that their experiences of violation were rarely acknowledged in official narratives. Conversations about accountability and restitution were sidelined by the urgency of ideological alignment. As a result, collective memory of personal suffering was suppressed, tucked away beneath debates over political systems and security imperatives. The combined effect of forced migration and unaddressed trauma contributed to a pervasive climate of distrust. Legal institutions, stretched thin by administrative reorganization, struggled to deliver justice for survivors of wartime and post-war abuses. Religious organizations eager to restore moral order often emphasized forgiveness and social cohesion at the expense of individual redress. Churches and state authorities alike championed narratives of unity and reconstruction, inadvertently marginalizing those whose wounds remained raw. This environment shaped a society that prized stability over scrutiny. Many displaced families, seeking to avoid further upheaval, chose silence over confrontation. Children who had witnessed or experienced forced relocation grew up internalizing a sense of impermanence and wariness. As reconstruction projects prioritized physical edifices, roads, factories, housing developments, emotional healing lagged behind, leaving an emotional deficit that would echo across generations. By anchoring so much attention on the geopolitical schism, neither East nor West Germany fully confronted the private tragedies born of that tumultuous period. It was only later, with the easing of Cold War divisions and the opening of archives, that the scale of post-conflict abuses and the depth of societal mistrust became fully apparent. Scholars and community leaders then began to piece together the connections between displacement, unaddressed transgressions, and the erosion of faith in legal and spiritual institutions. This chapter underscores a fundamental insight: rebuilding from the ruins of conflict demands more than reconstructing walls and highways. It requires an honest reckoning with the displacement and indignities endured by millions. Societies that overlook these human dimensions risk perpetuating alienation and skepticism. Only by integrating remembrance, restitution, and genuine dialogue into the process of recovery can lasting trust be restored, ensuring that the promise of peace encompasses not just political boundaries, but the dignity of every individual. Acknowledging and confronting the wrongdoings of the Allied forces is essential to fully grasp that liberation does not equate to infallibility. A historical narrative that ignores or minimizes uncomfortable truths creates a distorted legacy, one that exalts conquest while sidelining the suffering of those caught in its wake. It is only by illuminating every facet of wartime conduct, especially the abuses that were deliberately buried, that history achieves its integrity. Giving voice to survivors, championing the experiences of women and children, establishes a foundation for preventing similar violations in future crises. As historian Miriam Gebhardt observes, we cannot build a lasting peace if we celebrate victory alone while overlooking the accumulated anguish of ordinary people. Justice must extend into the period after the last shot is fired. This observation underscores a fundamental lesson: the boundary between liberator and oppressor can be perilously thin. Comprehensive justice, one that encompasses both battlefield decisions and the treatment of civilians in the aftermath, is the only means to heal the wounds of conflict. When communities reckon honestly with all dimensions of their past, they affirm the dignity of every individual affected. Survivor testimonies, once suppressed, become vital sources of understanding. They remind us that strategic success means little if it comes at the cost of human decency. By integrating these accounts into educational curricula, memorial programs, and public discourse, societies demonstrate a commitment to truth over convenience. Moreover, recognizing Allied transgressions does not diminish the magnitude of the crimes committed by the defeated regime. Rather, it enriches our moral perspective by refusing to view history through a single lens. This balanced approach fosters resilience, equipping future generations to scrutinize authority and to demand accountability, regardless of the uniforms worn by those in power. Concrete steps can reinforce this commitment. Truth commissions and independent investigations, established soon after hostilities, and ensure that allegations of wrongdoing are systematically recorded and addressed legal frameworks should mandate civilian oversight of military operations. With clear channels for reporting misconduct, psychological support programs must be designed to reach survivors immediately, preventing trauma from calcifying into lifelong scars. International cooperation plays a critical role as well. Shared archives, joint historical projects, and cross-border dialogues amplify the voices of victims from all sides, creating a shared space where healing can begin. When nations confront mutual failings, they build the trust necessary for lasting alliances. Finally, commemorative practices must evolve beyond victory parades. Monuments and ceremonies should honor not only the valor of those who fought, but also the resilience of those who endured the war's darkest hours. By doing so, societies signal that every life matters, that no story is too painful to be heard. The task of reconciling with a complex past is never easy. It requires courage from leaders and empathy from citizens. Yet, as the words of Gebhardt remind us, lasting peace is rooted in justice that reaches beyond battlefields. Only by upholding the principle that the end of conflict is not the end of responsibility can we hope to transform the legacy of war into a promise of a more compassionate future. This video not only revisits the painful chapters of history, but also delivers a powerful message about our shared responsibility to confront the truth. On the journey from the darkest days at the end of the Second World War to its far-reaching aftermath, viewers come to understand that liberation does not automatically mean infallibility. The narrative underscores the necessity of comprehensive justice from the moment hostilities end until every citizen is fully protected and restored. No survivor may be overlooked. The greatest value this video offers is empathy and understanding. Witnessing the fates of thousands of women and children who suffered both physical and emotional harm reminds us of the sacred worth of human dignity. No one civilian or soldier has the right to ignore another's plea for help. The video also urges future generations to remember the past, so that every decision related to conflict prioritizes the safety, respect, and protection of civilians above all else. From this story, we learn three main lessons. First, history must be told in full, including its most difficult truths, because only by understanding the past can we prevent its mistakes from repeating. Second, justice is not merely a courtroom verdict or sentence. It includes providing psychological and social support to survivors still bearing deep wounds. Finally, there is the power of speaking out. Only when survivors are encouraged to share their experiences can communities heal and build a lasting peace. The video concludes with a poignant reminder: true peace is not merely the absence of conflict. It is the commitment to safeguard human dignity in all circumstances. That is the most precious lesson this video offers to each of us.